Hello to those of you at the Ignatian Teach-In Conference. Thank you so much for selecting my presentation. I'm Soli Salgado, and it's actually my first time attending this conference, so hopefully we'll have some fun here talking about nuns and nuns. Just a little bit about myself. I am a staff writer for Global Sisters Report. For those of you who are unfamiliar with GSR, maybe you're familiar with National Catholic Reporter. We're the same company. GSR is a sister publication of NCR, and we focus on the work of women religious around the world and their social justice ministries. However, I focus on Latin America for GSR. So typically what I do is I find sisters in South or Central America. This was back when I was allowed to travel. And I would report on their different ministries. So it might be trafficking, migration, homelessness. But a couple years ago, I started writing about nuns and nuns, and what was supposed to be an introductory story, like just a one-stop what is it kind of thing, turned into a two-part series because I was just so fascinated by them, and I thought it was just super interesting, and I didn't stop writing, and then I had all these other ideas for other ways we could cover them, so I just never stopped writing about nuns and nuns, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm here to tell you about this network, movement, group, whatever you want to call it, because at your age, and I know not everyone who's listening here is a high school student, but that is who I had in mind, although really this kind of could speak to anyone. There's a chance you'll identify with either the sisters or the millennials or both. And even if you don't identify with either of them, I still think that studying the dynamics with the nuns and nuns, reveals what's exciting about the future of religious life, which I think is something that's missing a lot when we talk about religious life. So often when we talk about the future, it's just like in very grim terms because of these aging trends, which I'll talk about later. But nuns and nuns kind of lets you think a little creatively about what sisters of the future could look like. And at the same time, there's just so much that young people can learn from sisters, and they do in this group. So, they just have so much more in common than they probably ever suspected, and we're going to talk about all those things here. So before I get going on that, I do want to emphasize, millennial sisters do exist. I am not trying to erase this from, I'm not trying to erase them from the narrative. They're incredibly active, and they're incredibly, there's certainly a good number of them, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on the cross-generational aspects of nuns and nuns because I find that really interesting, and it is typically how nuns and nuns manifest. So here are a few numbers that help illustrate this dynamic. Like I said, sisters don't love when we talk about their aging trend because they see religious life as much more expansive than simple demographics, but the numbers do jump out. So more sisters in the US are older than 90 than are younger than 60, or another statistic, 90% of sisters are older than 60. However, young adults are experiencing a mirror dynamic when it comes to, religious unaffiliation, I guess. 40% of those who are between the ages of 18 and 29, and I think these numbers are a couple years old, so that includes a little bit of Gen Z, but mostly millennials. They're 4 times likelier to be non-religious than a generation ago. Again, 40%, so more than a third of millennials are non-religious. Or nuns, actually. Let me explain what that is. Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that is the box that you would check next to what religion you identify with, what religion you practice. And just because I find this interesting, understanding why they're leaving religion, I'm going to unpack that 40%. So according to Public Religion Research Institute, 60% of that 40% say the motivation for leaving their childhood religion was a lack of belief in religious teachings. And then a couple more numbers, a third say their family was never that religious. Another third say they don't like the church's teachings on LGBTQ people. And a few others, less than 20%, say the clergy sex abuse scandal turned them off from organized religion. Maybe they had a traumatic event in their life, or they didn't like their congregation becoming too focused on politics. And I know that doesn't add up to a tidy 100%. That had confused me in the past before, but it's because some people had multiple reasons before they decided to disaffiliate from their religion. But, despite all those reasons, they still have a desire for authentic community, a hunger for contemplative practice, a willingness to devote their lives to a greater purpose, a passion for social justice. Leaving institutional religion doesn't extinguish that desire that for some, religion did fulfill. So, and if you know anything about sisters, community, social justice, spirituality, and meaning making, as they call it. That is their bread and butter. And the way that Carol Zinn put it, Carol Zinn is a St. Joseph sister, and she's the executive director of LCWR. LCWR stands for Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and they represent 80% of sisters in the US. And Carol Zinn, is very involved in Nuns and Nones. And the way she put it, is that millennials, they've kind of found themselves to be a little aimless in their spiritual practice or desires for ritual ever since they left religion. And she said, these now friends of mine are realizing that you need some scaffolding to hold your life together, despite, having a general distaste for institutions. Throwing everything out is not acceptable, nor is accommodating yourself to everything that exists acceptable. It reminded me that the journey toward a meaningful life is a sweet spot. So some actually prefer that nuns and nones be called sisters and seekers because not everyone identifies with the NONES moniker. So NONES, that basically refers to the box that they would check next to religion. They are none for religion. And then also at the same time, sisters don't always consider themselves nuns. That kind of has the connotation of being cloistered. So some prefer to call it sisters and seekers because it does encompass a range of spiritualities. For those of you who are Catholic who find this compelling, the door is by no means closed to you. Those who are involved might range from atheist and agnostic to spiritual but not religious or spiritually curious, or Catholics, who are cradle Catholics, but maybe they still feel a little bit on the fringes for one reason or another, or they're still kind of trying to customize their own religious practices. So sisters and seekers, but who could resist the pun of nuns and nones? So I'm just gonna keep on with that one. So there are a few origin stories with how it began. So we're going to rewind to how and why and the purposes of nuns and nones. But basically what happened was there were a few individuals in different parts of the country who were simultaneously seeking community and spaces for sharing. This was back in 2016, early 2017. So in Michigan, Katie Gordon, she was about 26 at the time, she had read an article about sisters having to sell their oversized properties, which I'll get to more in a minute. But basically, sisters just have these huge convents, and because they're only getting older, they're finding themselves having to sell them. So she wrote a column in response, and she was just like, I know millennials could use community space, and I think institutions will do well to hear the perspectives of my generation. And at the time, she was writing a little tongue-in-cheek. So to her surprise, sisters ended up writing back saying they loved that idea, and they started getting together in Michigan. And about the same time, Adam Horowitz, he was in his early 30s living in New Mexico, and he was chatting with his friend Wayne Muller, who is a Presbyterian pastor, about how he feels like his community is missing places of welcome and belonging. And Wayne knew a lot of sisters and immediately recognized that there's a significant overlap between sisters and the young people like Adam who craved community and deep dialogue, and these spaces that Adam was missing are exactly what sisters have to offer, both in their literal empty properties, but also in their interest in sharing. So it all snowballed, and between Katie and Adam, they've created a national movement called Nuns and Nones with local chapters in dozens of cities around the US. And what they do is they basically meet weekly or monthly, typically monthly, and have these Zoom calls where they share pretty much what's on their mind. And that might include spiritual practices that have helped them out of a funk. It might be about what they're reading. It might be their concerns around activism and social justice. So, you can imagine that during this pandemic this year particularly, it's kind of been a moment for them where they've really just had this perfect technological infrastructure in place and these existential questions coming into play. But I'll get more into that later. But I want to mention this quote from Katie Gordon because I think it really helps illustrate this dynamic between sisters and millennials. So theologian and Franciscan friar Richard Rohr, he's spoken about the edge of the inside, Katie Gordon said. And for her, that imagery has been really helpful for her in understanding what Nuns and Nones is all about. she sees it as like, sisters are, because they're not part of the church's hierarchy, they're kind of on the edge of the inside, while millennials who are seeking spirituality are on the edge of the outside. They're not totally far gone away from religion, but they're not in there yet. She said, we're sort of this partnership that's been created to hold hands across the schism between those inside and outside the institution. I think that's been a healing and generative process for both of us, to learn from one another on what we're experiencing from where we stand. I love that quote. I just feel like it is a perfect, it just captures perfectly this relationship and also what's so special about it. And also, for me, it's been amazing to listen to these conversations and hear all that they have in common, because sisters aren't saying anything blasphemous by any means or anything contradictory to church teaching when they relate to these millennials, but they're still able to communicate their spirituality and their experiences in a way that can resonate with someone who's an agnostic. And it's kind of starting to crack me up how much they like share jargon and kind of, I don't know, their way of communicating is just like bleeding into each other. Like they use words like discernment and sacred hospitality and trust in the unfolding, and they quote the same theologians and they're reading the same things, and they don't know that I know they're reading the same things. And it's just so funny because when you interview sisters, I honestly, on a piece of paper, I wouldn't know who said it, if it was like a millennial in Nuns and Nones or a sister, because that's how similar they're starting to sound. But I also want to emphasize that this whole experience, this whole movement, it's not just about what millennials can learn from sisters. They're not just trying to like cull wisdom and taking notes on spiritual practices and that's where it ends. Sisters are getting a lot out of this too. They always are emphasizing that mutual exchange to me. For example, Mercy sister, Judy Carl, she says that oftentimes the millennials would ask her, what's your spiritual practice? And she said it struck her that they weren't asking, what do you believe? And she said, to me, that's helpful in any interreligious dialogue. Maybe doctrine or belief is not the first way of entering into a spiritual exchange. So instead, the conversations venture into contemplative practice and charisms. And if you don't know what a charism is, a lot of times congregations, or I'd say pretty much every congregation, has a charism, which is like their founding mission, and it fuels their ministries, their perspectives, their goals. So for example, some sisters might be focused on education. Some might be focused on healthcare. Some might be a little more vague and say, we're going to read the signs of the times and evolve with humanity on that. Others might have a preferential option for the poor. And so they talk about these things with the millennials, as well as their contemplative practices. And I say contemplative practice, and it sounds so jargony too, but like basically it's prayer. But if you're not religious, prayer doesn't speak to you, and it might not be a direct like prayer to God. It might be a little more of like a meditation. But yeah, contemplative practice, spiritual practice, prayer, you can imagine it kind of however you need to imagine it to understand this. But sisters, like I said, they're getting something out of this too. The sisters I spoke with see this movement as like a tweaked continuation of their congregation's charisms, which was basically to respond to critical human need, as Dominican sister Gloria Jones put it. So that though that used to revolve around social needs, founding hospitals, orphanages, schools, she said today the critical human need is related to community, to a spiritual quest, to finding meaning. And so it's not about establishing these huge fancy ministries like gigantic hospitals like they used to do. She said, with Nuns and Nones, it's almost like the Spirit creating a new possibility for us as women religious, almost a refounding. And I'm thinking of one man I interviewed for a story. His name was Jerome. He's agnostic, he's polyamorous, he's Taiwanese American. He founded a community collective, like very bohemian type. And he said, like very confidently, without a doubt, had I been born as a woman half a century ago, I would absolutely be a nun. If you wanted to do good in the world, this was your ticket. And I like to bring up Jerome because many millennials are drawn to the movement to learn about spiritual practice, but for him, The possibilities also delved into the practicals, such as the infrastructure that allows for communal living and finances. And I think a lot of times when we think of, sisters and congregations and convents, we kind of take for granted just how radical that is. Sisters are, it is an incredibly radical lifestyle that a lot of millennials are now interested in modeling. It's like a lifestyle of security that at least Jerome specifically said he would love to model on a smaller scale. And, I'm also reminded, I asked Sister Ursula and Sister Michelle Morg, she's a sister who I work with, and back when we were sharing an office, back when we went to an office, and I remember I hung up after one interview and I said, Michelle, why did you join religious life? And she said, the question shouldn't be why did I join, but it's why did I stay? Because the reason sisters join religious life decades ago is probably not the same. They might have been 18, 20. She's like, the reason's not the same decades later when you're in your 70s. But for her, the answer for why she's still a sister is because of community. And I want to keep emphasizing the point of community because, like I said, I think we've kind of taken for granted just how expert sisters can be in that lifestyle. So anyway, I always like sharing that point by Michelle. So back to the oversized properties that I mentioned earlier. So one of the side effects of women religious growing older is that they're struggling to fill these huge convents. Some of them might be selling them and figuring out how they can downsize. Others are trying to figure out how they can fill those spaces. And Mercy Sisters, who live outside San Francisco, California, they live in Burlingame. For them, Nuns and Nones was one way to breathe new life into their huge campus. So they had a residency program. It was the pilot, first of its kind for Nuns and Nones. And that was when 4 millennials moved into the convent for 6 months. I went in 2020 and I did a story on this, but the millennials, they basically were working remotely so that they could create a community with the sisters who lived there. They were literally living in a convent and just kind of working from their laptops or whatever they were able to do. And what's funny was I remember their living room or their gathering space, whatever they called it. I found it so fascinating because it was like a microcosm of Nuns and Nones. They had books on new cosmology, anthropology, herbal medicine, just sitting next to books on religious vows and the gifts of community life. And they had Jewish prayers hung next to mosaics of Catholic saints. And they had a whiteboard that, it was a to-do list of scheduled talks on composting and spiritual formation, which from an outsider, it's just none of this makes sense. But if you know sisters, it also is yeah, I guess that would be in a convent too. So it was just kind of funny to see how that manifested in their program. So one sister who was part of that residency program, Sister Diane Klein, she told me how enriching it was for the sisters to have the millennials ask questions that as sisters, they don't generally ask themselves. She said they would ask her, why do you get up early to contemplate? And what does that look like for you? And what do you get out of it? She said, sisters, we don't tend to have those conversations. So this program was an invitation for them to think through their own spirituality and practices and be reflective on that. And together, the millennials and the sisters, in that time living together, they would have workshops and speakers on the topics of gender and sexuality, racism, and other tough questions that maybe aren't directly related to religion or spirituality, but are still enriching when they're happening across generations and backgrounds. How often are elderly nuns, engaging in bohemian type and younger millennials who are interested in the same things? And then meanwhile, the millennials would learn about the vows of poverty, obedience, chastity, and all the dimensions of it. Maybe how the sisters interpret the vows differently or in broader ways than you might think. And they were getting inspired for what it might look like for them to build a life around those same vows, or maybe personalizing the vows according to their beliefs or values, which I found was just super cool. You learn so much about sisters with how they interpret their vows, because I think that's the part that if you're not a sister, you find the least relatable or maybe the most extreme part. So I love that they dove into the vows and even thought about how it might look in their lives. One of the participants, Alan Webb, he's in his 30s, he said that it's become this quest for me. What would the modern monk in a tiny home look like? And how do I try to create the conditions where I can continue to embody something of what I felt here as an invitation to others? How do we mutually fortify each other in a countercultural community, doing stuff that our friends or parents don't understand all the time, that we believe is grounded in something more deeply? And for him, living with the sisters was totally inspiring for those questions. And honestly, I mean, just like the way he said all of that just sounded so sistery to me. And, you know, I loved the image of a modern monk in a tiny home, and the part about, you know, maybe friends or parents not understanding that countercultural desire. I mean, sisters, they can totally relate to that. So often they're like, my family was so confused or mad that I joined religious life. And so you can really understand that partnership there. So the residency program that lasted 6 months, the idea initially was for the program to resemble a novitiate. If you don't know what that is, it's like the spiritual formation that sisters go through before they profess their final vows. And I think the canonical year is what the year before their final vows, that's what they call it. And in that year, they do a lot of reading and retreats and spiritual meditations and all those things. And so the Nuns and Nones, they were like, you know, we wanted to do something like that, have this very spiritually formative year. It's a little tricky when they had work obligations to do like this lengthy meditative spiritual retreat. But they try to do what they can. And now they've become inspired for the future in terms of like what other programs could look like. So they're getting creative and imagining maybe retreats on the border or other action-oriented programs that combine this experience with justice issues that they're devoted to. So that's something to look at, the way that Nuns and Nones can evolve, or all these different either residency programs or retreats or relationships. That's something I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on. And, you know, just to circle back on a story that I referenced earlier, I wrote about how the pandemic has weirdly been a moment where Nuns and Nones can really shine. Obviously, I'm not suggesting they're happy about what's going on, but the movement essentially has equipped its participants to kind of handle this uncertainty a little better than others maybe. They've already had the technological infrastructure in place with their regular Zoom calls. They've already been talking about the existential questions that are probably on everyone's minds these days. And they've established a consistent community that can serve as a lifeline for these isolating times. And so I'm not saying that they're doing better than other people, but it's just one of those networks that it was just sort of made for moments like this. The millennials are especially eager to hear from sisters who have lived through other crises to kind of tap into their perspectives and lived experiences. And, you know, sisters, like I mentioned earlier, their focus is meaning making. Benedictine sister Linda Romy, she's active in Nuns and Nones. You know, just to kind of explain what I mean by meaning making, she was talking about how seeking meaning is inherent with the human experience. And you can look at Buddha, Abraham, Saint Benedict. They're all examples of how humanity has always been on this like relentless metaphysical quest. And she said, all the way back to the nomadic tribes, there was something that called them out of themselves, and it is still in us today. Human beings have always looked for what Nuns and Nones are looking for. At a time like this, I feel like it's intensified. And I mentioned earlier too about how there's so much we can learn about religious life through looking at Nuns and Nones. You know, I mentioned sisters are just so tired of that diminishment narrative, which is the obsession with their trends in aging and all these grand declarations of how religious life is coming to an end just because some congregations are coming to completion. They are having to close and they're the last of their community. And I never totally sympathized with that frustration before. It kind of, you know, as a reporter, I thought, well, I'm reporting on the numbers, and the numbers are very clear that it's just not totally sustainable. And so I will just report on that. And I found it to be interesting, you know, that trend for religious life. But reporting on Nuns and Nones has been illuminating to me on why that the diminishment narrative it just seems so small to them. You know, it's because they are less concerned with being the last of their congregation and more about who will inherit their charism, their mission, you know? So they are thinking creatively about just what will religious life look like. They said, you know, it's not going to be the same. But they were like, you know, when we were founded, our congregations, they were like, we were just, you know, 4 little ladies who went out into the streets and tried to figure out what it was that people needed from us. And maybe now we're not, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands like we once were, but we will be closer to our founders, and we are just going to be responding to the needs around us. And, you know, as one sister said, I think Dominican sister Gloria Jones, she said the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, she said the nuns wouldn't identify with being followers of Jesus in the same way, but the Spirit works in many ways. Humans are the ones who put limits, saying it's not authentic because it's not lined up with this. The Spirit is much more creative and expansive, and I just love that. And you know, I could honestly talk about Nuns and Nones all day. There's just something about it that speaks to me personally. It's like my peers and the sisters I report on are fusing. It's like I'm watching them discover each other in a way that's just fascinating and prophetic. And you know, another story that I just turned in is probably online now by the time this is up, but it's about how Nuns and Nones has also been a way for younger people to learn about activism through sisters. They're learning how to be effective advocates and protesters for justice issues. So if you want to learn more about these relationships and all the ways it's spinning off and inspiring others, check it out at globalsistersreport.org. You know, I promise that I'm not done reporting on them. There's just so many different angles that this can take. So anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me ramble and for giving me an excuse to dive into the subject. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Twitter at Soli_Salgado. You can also email me for sure at ssalgado at ncronline.org. And my work on the subject is only continuing, so keep an eye out and enjoy your gathering. And please feel free to reach out to me. Anyway, all right. Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.